In this video, I'll be covering exactly how I got an A star in my EPQ and provide you with the tips and tricks to help you do the same. And don't worry, there's no generic advice in here that you already know about, like time management. It's all going to be specific advice to help you improve your ideation, research, writing, and your presentation. And make sure you stay tuned till the end because I'm going to share the exact EPQ that I wrote in PDF form, including my activity log, bibliography, and my presentation slides. But before we do that, let's get straight into the main chunk of this video, which is the exact blueprint to get an A star. All right, so the first and most important decision that we make when we write our EPQ is choosing a good title. Now, typically the title for your dissertation will be a question, and there's three things to consider when we think about choosing a good question. First of all, it's really obvious, do you enjoy it? The topic you go for and the question you choose is something that you're committed to for almost a year. And if you don't enjoy researching and learning about this topic, then you're not going to enjoy writing your EPQ, which makes the entire process so much more difficult. So choose something that you think is interesting, actually try and read about it, and make sure that it's something you enjoy before you commit to it. Now, the second thing to consider when choosing this question is whether it's too broad or too narrow. The best way you're going to actually find out whether your topic is too broad or too narrow is just by researching in that field, by Googling it, looking at different research papers on PubMed, and basically finding out if there's enough information about this topic where you can actually synthesize a good argument. And if your topic is too broad, what you might find is there are loads of sub-questions related to your topic. And the best thing for you may be to narrow down to one of these sub-questions so that you're not overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there. But of course, it could be that your question is too narrow and therefore there's just not enough information and you're basically stuck for actually finding research. So in that case, you might have to broaden your horizons a little bit. Now, the third part of choosing a good question, and I think this is the most important part of the entire process, is having a thesis and an antithesis. And to put that plainly, you essentially need a for argument and an against argument. So in my example, my question was, is chemotherapy the best treatment for lung cancer? So my for argument is, yes, chemotherapy is the best treatment. And my against argument is, no, chemo is not the best treatment. And this is really important when you actually start writing your dissertation, and especially for the discussion section. Okay, so now we've chosen our topic, we've written out our question, and we're happy that it's not too broad or too narrow, and there's a thesis and an antithesis. What happens next? Okay, so in my opinion, we should focus on structure before we move on to research. So you want to know what the structure of your dissertation is going to look like. Now, I looked at the exam board mark schemes on this, and there's no exact structure that these exam boards recommend. But what I would say is go with what your supervisor suggests. And if they haven't given you enough information, then I'd follow the structure of a review article or just a scientific paper. And to give an example of the structure I used, this is the contents page from my EPQ. So now the two most important things when it comes to structure is firstly making sure that everything is clear and each section has its own purpose. So with the literature review, you're not actually arguing any points, you're just providing the information that's already out there and writing it in your own words. Whereas with the discussion, it's more of an argument between the for and the against, so it looks more like an analytical essay than maybe the literature review. Now the second thing with the structure, and this goes hand in hand kind of while you're researching, is actually to figure out what the subheadings of each section are going to look like. And the best way to do this is to split your question up into some subgroups or subtopics, and that way you can start to figure out how you're going to structure each section. So for example, for me, I knew that if I'm comparing chemotherapy to other treatments, I have to figure out what the other treatments are, what are the most common ones, and therefore which ones am I going to compare chemotherapy against. And then a further way to split it, especially when it came to the discussion, was to think about all the factors that make a good treatment, and therefore splitting it up into things like side effects or cost or the actual effectiveness of treatment itself. So to recap what we've covered so far, we now know how to write a good question and how to structure the EPQ. So now we can move on to actually researching our information. So when it comes to the EPQ, and especially for writing a dissertation, the whole point is to conduct second-hand research. So essentially, you're looking at the information that's already out there that someone has collected as primary data, and essentially compiling it together in your own format to answer the question that you've chosen. The initial stage of research should just be to figure out the point of your topic. More often than not, the topic you choose for your EPQ is far beyond the syllabus that you have at A-level or at GCSE. So you need to really go above and beyond and actually understand what is going on before you move to actually writing an argument. So the way I would go about doing this is to start with YouTube videos and just understand the topic in the first place. So for example, for me, I was looking at lung cancer. So essentially for me, I'd find the most simple videos possible on lung cancer, how it's caused, and the basics of each treatment. And that way I'd have a very broad understanding of my topic and what I'm actually looking to find out. So once I had this basic understanding, I then moved on to the internet where I found different websites and articles and book chapters, which took a more in-depth perspective on lung cancer and its treatments. So the best thing to do is whenever you find a website or an article that you think is interesting, do two things. First of all, use a reference manager like EndNote or Mendeley, and essentially use those to store all the websites and articles that you find, and therefore you can go back to them when you need to find out this information. And secondly, track these sources on a Google Sheets or an Excel file and have two columns that essentially say whether it's a primary or secondary source, and also whether it was high quality or low quality. So when it comes to evaluating these sources later down the line, you have much more information to go. Okay, so now let's move on to talking about writing this A-star dissertation. First of all, as mentioned before, keep everything simple. Keep the structure as basic as possible so that you can expand within each section. Next, using the data that you found in your research through articles and websites, start writing down bullet points under each section. You'll start to figure out that, especially for the literature review, this is quite simple. You just write your bullet points and then just turn it into full sentences. In contrast, for the discussion, especially for those A-stars, it's important to have that thesis antithesis argument. So you want to structure your paragraph something like this. By highlighting your for argument and then instantly contrasting it with your against argument, you're able to describe that critical thought when you're answering this question, and it shows to your supervisor or an external examiner that you really have understood your topic. And most importantly, as you get taught in GCSE English, make sure you link back to the question at the end of each paragraph, especially in the discussion. Okay, so now moving on to the final bits of our writing, which is going to be reading, editing, and then most importantly, the evaluation. So when it comes to editing and making sure everything flows well, you want to actually read the sentences aloud, because that way you get to see if something feels clunky and you're able to change it, rather than when you read, you sort of tend to skip past things. And most importantly, make sure you actually listen to what your supervisor's advice is. If they don't like what they see, at the end of the day, they're the marker, and therefore, even if you love what you've written, you should probably edit it if you want that A-star. And of course, there's absolutely no harm in sending them an email or scheduling a meeting where you can actually figure out all the little things that you can improve to actually boost your grade. Okay, so now final thing of the write-up before the presentation, which is the evaluation. Now, this is where your activity log becomes very, very important, because you can use your activity log to essentially figure out where you were going well and where you think you made mistakes, and that way you can use it to write your evaluation. So my evaluation was very simple. It was a basic introduction paragraph, then moving on to what I learned, and then finally ending off with what I did well and what could be improved. Okay, so now final bit of this video is all about the presentation. Now the first thing I'd say is absolutely don't panic. You'll be fine for your presentation if you practice enough and you follow these tips. First of all, I'd say keep the presentation as clear and simple as possible. I don't think you get any extra marks for fancy, unnecessary transitions or effects. Instead, make sure the information on the slides provides a simplified version of what you're saying. And otherwise, for the presentation, I think the absolute best thing I did was just practice it with my friends and family before I actually gave it. I think for me, before I actually gave my presentation, I practiced it with my family about 4 or 5 times. And I don't think it's as bad, because by the time you're doing your presentation, you've worked on this topic for almost a year, so you know it inside out. And in your presentation, you'll also be asked to do an evaluation of the EPQ. So using the evaluation you've already written, you can simplify that down and essentially be critical but fair with your contribution to the work. And of course, talk about the skills you've developed outside of research itself. And one final top tip for the presentation is to plant questions. You're going to be asked questions either by your supervisor or your peers, so you may as well ask your friends to ask you 2 or 3 questions that you know are going to come up, and that way you have a good answer to each of them. So that concludes all of my tips for each section of the EPQ, and of course, most importantly, I know I've mentioned this loads of times before, but please listen to your supervisor and make sure you actually take on the advice that they have on board. I think that is probably the most important thing if you want to get an A-star. So that marks the end of this video on how I got an A-star in my EPQ. If you're looking to actually access my EPQ in PDF form, then this is what you're going to do. Okay, so it's super simple. Firstly, you're going to head over to this website, and the link's also down below in the description, and it should be pretty self-explanatory from there, but just in case, you just put in 0 as your fair price and 0 as the tip as well. And if you put in your email, you'll get emailed this link, which essentially just gives you access to my EPQ as a PDF to download or just to view online. So that actually marks the end of this video. So hopefully that was of some value to you, and the EPQ itself is useful. Make sure you don't plagiarize for your own sake, and otherwise I'll see you in the next one.